everyone. This is Dr. Neeti Bhutani, and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at Hindu College. Today, we are starting with a new course titled Law and Economics. And the first topic that we're going to cover under this course is contract law, the economics of contract law in particular. But before we get into the details of contract law and the various economic models that are involved here, let us first understand what we mean by a contract. So, a contract is a promise or a voluntary agreement between parties that is legally enforceable. It is a promise that is enforceable by law, and this is where the law comes in. But let me elaborate on the different aspects of this definition, because there is a lot that is going on here and we need to understand all these aspects. So in particular, I'm going to highlight three aspects in this definition. The first is a contract as a voluntary agreement. The second is a contract as a promise. And the third aspect in the definition, which we need to understand, is enforceability by law. So first things first, when we look at a contract as a voluntary agreement, basically we are talking of an agreement where there is no element of force. So a court will validate an agreement only as long as there is, for example, no element of coercion or duress. Then next, let us talk about contracts as promises. So in daily life, in our lives, we all make promises to each other. Couples make the promise of marriage, or you might promise your mother that you will behave better in the coming month. Then political candidates make campaign promises all the time. And you could then even talk about a promise made by an individual or a store owner or an online platform to provide a good or a service in exchange for money. There are just so many examples here, and one could just go on and on. But one thing that is common amongst all these promises, one thing that characterizes all these promises is the idea of a deferred exchange, which is to say that if you just think a little bit about the promises that I'm talking about here, all these examples that I've given, and I'll make this idea even crispier in the coming slides, there is a certain amount of time that passes before one or more commitments are fulfilled. In that sense, it is a deferred exchange. Also, the law, let us look at where the law comes in. Again, I'm just going over the main points right now. I'll elaborate on them in a bit. The law becomes involved when someone seeks to have a promise enforced. Now, what does this mean? See, a promise is a promise, and there is always a possibility that the promise might be broken. So let's say a promise is made to you, and that promise is not fulfilled. So you can seek court intervention here. But the question is, will the court actually intervene? Will it provide you a remedy for the broken promise? And that is the idea of legal enforceability. Will the court enforce the promise that has been broken? Will the court provide a remedy to the victim of the broken promise? But I'll come to legal enforceability after first talking about promises. And let me first give you some idea in the sense, let me walk you through a couple of environments which involve promises, some environments from daily life. Let me walk you through such examples. So our first example here is that of Myntra, which we all know is an online retail platform. And Myntra has this express delivery option where it promises to deliver the good that is ordered online in not more than 2 days. So Anita here is a customer, and she wants to buy a dress from Myntra. So she will transfer money online today. She'll make the payment today online to Myntra. And this will be in exchange for the address that she will receive from Myntra in 2 days. Now look here at the idea of a deferred exchange, because if you notice here, the transaction is not immediately completed today. The money is paid today. The promise is made by Myntra today, but the dress is actually delivered after 2 days. So one of the commitments in the entire set of commitments is being fulfilled only after a certain lapse of time. In that sense, we're talking of a deferred exchange. Okay, so this is the kind of transaction that we're talking about. And in particular, this is this is a case of what we call a payment for a promise, which is to say that Anita makes a payment today in exchange for a promise by Myntra to deliver a dress to her in 2 days. Okay. Similarly, we can also talk of a situation where, in this example, let's say you have a mobile phone store in your neighborhood, and the store is Mobile Company, which has a buy now, pay later scheme. So the Mobile Company store says, okay, we will deliver a mobile phone to you today, and you can always pay the money 1 month from now. So here we have this customer who's absolutely happy with the deal, and she's willing to take the delivery of the mobile phone today in exchange for a payment 1 month from now. And this is the case of goods for a promise. So this is the case where a good is delivered today in exchange for the promise of a payment 1 month from now, in exchange for a promise of a future payment. So that is where the promise comes in, where that commitment is fulfilled in the future. Okay. Similarly, even a service could be provided today in exchange for a promise of a future payment in the future. In this case, we have Klinos, which is willing to paint Jackie's house today in exchange for a payment made by Jackie sometime in the future, whatever point in time they have agreed upon. So this is a case of a service for a promise. Now, if you notice, in all the 3 examples that we've done so far, we have one of the parties fulfilling their commitment at a future point in time. It's only one of the 2 parties. But we could also have a situation where both the parties make a promise to each other, where both the commitments are to be fulfilled at a future point in time. And here we are talking of a case which is called promise for a promise. And to illustrate, we have here the case of an orange farm. So there is a farmer who grows oranges, and he enters into an agreement with a juice company, wherein he agrees to deliver oranges to the juice company, let's say in the coming winter. And at the time the oranges are delivered, the juice company will pay the pre-agreed the price agreed upon in the agreement to the orange farmer. So this is a case of a promise for a promise, where both the commitments on the part of both parties are fulfilled in the future. Now, what binds all of these examples together is, and these are the kinds of exchanges that we're going to talk about in contract law, that aspect that we're trying to highlight is that of a deferred exchange. As I've just mentioned, in all these transactions, what we see is that there is a certain amount of time that elapses between the making of a promise and the fulfillment of the promise. Between the making of a promise and the actual performance of the promise. Now, because there is this time lapse between the making of a promise and its actual fulfillment, its actual performance, there is going to be some risk involved, because there's always a possibility that the promise which is made by any particular party may not be fulfilled. So let's, to illustrate, let's go back to our first example, where Anita in the transaction makes a payment today. But the question that will be in Anita's mind is, will Myntra actually deliver after 2 days? Will Myntra actually deliver the dress after 2 days? So Anita would want to make the payment today only when she knows that Myntra too has a legal obligation to deliver the dress within 2 days. So it's not just a moral obligation, it's also a legal obligation. And that is where the law comes in, because Anita would be willing to pay today only as long as the promise is legally enforceable. She should know that if the promise is broken, if Myntra does not deliver, she can seek court intervention, and the court will intervene in her behalf if the promise is legally enforceable, and the court will provide a remedy to the victim, in this case Anita, if the promise is broken. So I hope you now understand what I mean by enforceability. A promise is enforceable if the courts offer a remedy to the victim of the broken promise. Okay, so I hope the two aspects of the definition, what we mean by promises, what are the different kinds of promises, what are the different kinds of transactions that involve promises, what those are, and what we mean by legal enforceability. I hope the meanings of these two aspects in the definition of a contract are clear. And this then now requires us, the next thing that we have to do is we have to connect these two aspects. And this then leads us to the two fundamental questions in contract law. The first is, are all promises legally enforceable? So we have talked about promises, we have talked about enforceability, but the question is, are all promises legally enforceable? Or is it that there are certain kinds of promises which will not be entertained by the court? And remember that enforceability is going to have this immediate consequence that it's, for example, if you go back to that first example of Anita versus who enters into an agreement with Myntra. So here, when there is enforceability, there is this legal obligation on the part of Myntra to perform. There'll be an incentive on the part of the seller to perform. And at the same time, also remember that the seller would also want enforceability. It's not just Anita who would want enforceability. It's also the seller, because the seller knows that if there is legal enforceability, then there's also an incentive for the buyer to enter into the agreement, and the buyer would also have an incentive to buy because he has that safety net. So these are the issues that we're going to be looking at in contract law. Are all promises legally enforceable? That is the first fundamental question. And the second is, what should be the remedy for the breach of a legally enforceable promise? If a legally enforceable promise is broken, what is the remedy that the court should provide to the victim of a broken promise? And this then takes us to the bargain theory of contracts. This is one of the theories that helps us answer these two fundamental questions of contract law. But this is something we will cover in the next lecture. And here in the next lecture, we're going to be highlighting three elements that are part of any bargain. These three elements are offer, acceptance, and consideration. I've sort of given an idea of what these three mean, but I haven't given those meanings names. So that is something we're going to cover in the next lecture. But before I leave, let me leave you with this question. So I'm going to give you two situations, and you can start thinking about whether the promises made in these two situations are legally enforceable or not, and why are they legally enforceable if they are. So here, the first situation is one where your uncle, happy with your result in the previous semester, promises to give you rupees 51,000 by next week. So this is like a gift that your uncle gives you because he's happy with your result. And the second situation is where your uncle promises to pay you rupees 51,000 if you secure a grade A in your final law and economics exam this semester. If you qualify, your uncle will make the payment within 1 week of the declaration of the result. So think about which situation is one where the promise is legally enforceable. Thank you.